So looking at the May-June 2017 paper, on question number 1, we are asked to provide a comprehensive explanation of the lending process. So they ask us to give a comprehensive explanation of the lending process. If you check, see, in your textbook, the one that we're using, in the textbook, the one that we're using, it's not really given in detail. So it's not really given in detail. So I had to use another textbook that someone shared, which is called Credit Risk Management. And I'll also share that textbook, but I think it's already in one of the groups. So I'll also share the textbook on the other group as well. So in the book, they give a detailed guideline of the credit process. So they give a detailed guideline of the credit process, and the credit process is outlined So the credit process is outlined from page 22 of the textbook, but they give us a diagram to explain the credit process, where they say, when you look at the credit process, they say the first step, you look at the credit origination and generation. Then from there, we look at the credit proposed and assessed. Then from there, we look at the credit approval. Then from there, we also look at loan documentation and disbursement. Then we look at credit administration. And then we look at problems, loans, and loan workout. Then the last step, we look at the mission and objectives to establish credit philosophy and credit culture as well. So looking at the credit process there, if you check on page 22 of the textbook.
Sorry, Reynolds, can you just tell us, yes, what's the name of the textbook? Who's the author?
The author of the textbook is the name of the textbook is called Credit Risk Management: How to Avoid Lending Disasters and Maximize Earnings. And these are the two authors of the textbook as well. So I'm going to share the textbook on the WhatsApp groups.
Thank you.
I think I've already shared it on WhatsApp group.
Yeah. I'll just reshare them in case someone didn't get it previously. So if you go to page 22, They say whatever functional approach is established within the credit organization, the credit process will typically begin with the origination of new business and revolve around supporting credit functions that are highlighted in figure 12.12, 2.12, which is the one that we are looking just now. And here they say, marketing or relationship management is usually conducted by the business development or loan department and is the original and sometimes primary contact with borrowers. So because relationship managers are also charged with having full knowledge about the borrower's business and industry, they will usually propose to the credit department or approving authorities the supporting reasons to extend new credit transaction in the credit application. So the credit application therefore becomes a primary document to drive the credit process, in that it serves as a basis to derive historical borrower information that will subsequently be used in credit risk measurement. Information relevant to the borrower, characteristics, exposure amounts, and facility types will be gathered and collected from credit applicants to measure future potential losses from credit exposures. So credit risk approval is then based on the credit assessment and risk measurement applications after assigned risk ratings are given to support the credit analysis and qualify a borrower's probability of default to exposure losses. So credit rating systems have been a significant development in modern credit applications. And depending on the type of system that is used, the credit process can be integrated to appropriate information system technology so that credit functions can be inclusively performed in a variety of tasks. So as we will discuss in chapter 9, dual tier rating systems, such as those used by larger organizations to risk rate both borrowers and facilities, can provide accounting information and monitor credit limits, as well as perform quantifying calculations on credit risk exposures. So approved transactions are also require that the credit organization have a credit process in place that oversees loan documentation prior and subsequent to the disbursements of funds. Once all the required documentation is obtained and the funds are disbursed, an established system will need to be in place for the ongoing servicing and monitoring of facilities. So credit administration is therefore a vital function in the credit process that requires the lender to monitor transactions through customer review on annual and more frequent terms. So this will allow the lender to understand the borrower's financial and operating conditions, as well as to better identify problem credits. So credit administration will also support portfolio objectives by monitoring and controlling collateral in order to ensure that appropriate lines remains current and are perfected on security along with any required covenants. So monitoring the total exposure limits for maximum transaction amounts is also essential to prevent the risk of credit loss, particularly for lenders that engage in capital market activities. So by assessing the concentration of credit exposure limits on a daily basis, lenders can remain abreast of how credit assets are performing throughout the term of the facilities. Because lenders cannot avoid having some losses, even if only a minimal amount, a workout unit or a group to manage borrower transactions that do default is also required, is also a required credit process and functions to recover funds from defaulted credit obligations as well. Then they also say, so that's basically the process there. So they also go on to look at credit portfolio and credit policy and portfolio management, which is the one that they are discussing looking at figure 12.13. I don't think you should really worry much about it. So make sure that you're able to go through this section again and understand the credit process that they give as well. Remember, this question was also asked in the assignments. And if you check on the feedback that the lecturer gave for the assignments, in the assignment, they look at the review of the credit process as well. And if you check on the lecturer's feedback, so they say, this is just a guide. Students' answers will strictly be organization specific, and no cut and paste will be accepted as well. Even in the exam as well, they want you to be able to show your understanding instead of just cutting and pasting what you've seen in the textbook as well. So here they look at, when they look at the credit process, they look at origination, monitoring, and workout or handover or collection as well. So under that, under origination, this is where they look at, when you look under responsibility, they look at the business units, and they also look at the credit risk as well. And the key activities under this, under origination, where they say, this is where they look at credit rating, evaluation of applications, risk adjudicated pricing, and collateral valuation as well. Then from there, they look at monitoring, and the key responsibility is where it lies with the business units, the credit risk, and understanding the market risk as well. And then under monitoring, the key activities would be monitoring and identification of the cases turning bad, reclassification or provisioning of bad loans, also taking corrective actions as well. Then the other step would be the workout or handover or collection as well. So this is the key responsibility there is basically looking at what? Debt recovery. And the key activity would be recovery of bad debts and closing insolvable cases as well. Then as a last note here, they say the credit risk department must cooperate with the banks, IT and finance for maintenance of credit risk data as well. So that's basically what the lecturer put in as a general guideline. But remember, the general guideline, the lecturer was saying that it's just a general guideline. It's not necessarily that you strictly have to follow this. That's why I had to use another text, because in your recommended textbook, there is not really that much information that I would say is going to be able to allow you to answer the question as well. So that's why I had to use another source document for us to be able to look at this particular question. So,
Reina, sorry if I may ask, can you just show us the pages again, just that you used?
It's page 23 to 24.
Thank you.
Yeah. Are there any questions? Moving on to the next question. Question 2, they give us that information. For question 2, they give us that information and they ask us to determine the expected return and the standard deviation of the portfolio. And looking at the portfolio, they say they have 2 loans of 5 million each. So they have 2 loans of 5 million each, and they ask us to calculate the expected return and standard deviation of that portfolio. So from the given information, they ask us to calculate the expected return and the standard deviation of the portfolio. So to calculate the expected return, we know that the expected return, is given as the sum of the returns multiplied by the, so it's given as the sum of the returns multiplied by the weight of the investment. So it's the sum of the returns multiplied by the weight of the investment. So in this case, we are, for demonstrative purposes, to accumulate and maximize as much marks as possible. If they give you the amounts invested in each loan, you need to demonstrate how you manage to deduce the weights as well. So which means, remember they say the loans are invested of 5 million each. So I'm going to say you have loan 1, which is worth 5 million. And then you have loan 2, which is also worth 5 million. So the total investment, the total of the loans is 10 million. So the total amount of the loans is 10 million. Then from there, we're now going to say, so from there, we're now going to say the weight of the first loan is equals to 5 million over 10 million, which gives us a weight of 0.5. And the weight of the second loan is equals to 5 million over 10 million, which gives us a weight of 0.5. So which means the expected return is equal to, for the first loan, it was giving out an expected loan of 12, expected return of 12%. And we know that the first loan has a weight of 0.5. Plus the second loan had a weight, had an expected return of 10% and a weight of 0.5. So in this case, the expected return will be how much? So how much would be the expected return?
It's 65.
Sorry? It will be how much?
11%.
11, because it will be 6 plus 5, which gives you 11%. Then we also need to calculate the standard deviation of this portfolio. So we need to calculate the standard deviation of this portfolio of 2 loans. And when you look at the standard deviation of this portfolio of 2 loans, you will see that the standard deviation of the portfolio is given as the square root of the weight of loan 1 squared times the standard deviation of loan 1 squared plus the weight of loan 2 squared times the standard deviation of loan 2 squared plus 2 times the weight of loan 1 times the weight of loan 2 times the correlation coefficient of loan 1 and 2 times the standard deviation of loan 1 times the standard deviation of loan 2. So this will give us the standard deviation of the portfolio. And also take note that the correlation coefficient of the 2 loans times the standard deviation of loan 1 times the standard deviation of loan 2 gives us the covariance of loan 1 and 2. So that gives us the covariance of loan 1 and 2. So it will depend whether they give you the correlation coefficient or they give you the covariance. So if they give you the covariance, it means this part of the equation has been solved for you already. So from the given information, it means the standard deviation of the portfolio is going to be the square root of the weight of loan 1, which is 0.5 squared, times the standard deviation of loan 1, which is given as 12.5%. So as a decimal is 0.125 squared, plus the weight of loan 2, which is 0.5 squared, times the standard deviation of loan 2, which is given as 10%. So it's going to be 0.1 squared plus 2 times the weight of loan 1 times the weight of loan 2 times the correlation coefficient between loan 1 and 2, which in this case, they give us the covariance. They say it is determined that the covariance between the two loans is 3%, right? So instead of giving us this information, they give us the covariance. So we're going to simply multiply by the covariance of 3%, which is 0.03. So in this case, how much would you get as the standard deviation of the portfolio?
%15.1%.
Okay. So you must be able to get, just show the breakdown. Are we getting the same amounts?
Rhinos. For the first one, I got 0.0625. I don't know, is there something I'm missing?
Yeah, because 0.5 squared is 0.25, right?
Mm.
Then 0.125 squared is 0.015625. Are you getting the same amount?
Yes, I've seen with a sharp calculator. It's 0.00390625. So I wanted to ask, what do you call this? I'm sorry, I didn't do math.
Which
I
one?
don't know. This is it a square root or what?
Which one? This
This
sign here.
formula. Eh,
Yes, this is the square root. Remember, you are looking for the square root of everything that you have calculated in this. So you're going to look for the square root of everything that you've calculated there.
because when I do this one with a square root, with a Casio calculator, it gives me 0.0625. But when I use sharp, it gives me 0.00390625.
It's because if you're going to put the square root sign at the beginning, you are safe if you open brackets, then you do everything here, then you close brackets. The reason why you'll be opening brackets there is because you're specifically telling your calculator that you want to look for the square root of everything in between. If you put square root here and then you start typing everything else after that, it will only look for the square root of this and not everything else.
It makes sense.
So if you're going to be trying to put everything all at once, rather, after you put square root, open brackets, then you put everything as is, then you close brackets. You'll see that you'll get exactly the same answer. Are we getting the same amount?
Yes.
Okay.
Rhinos,
Hmm?
can you please go back and break it down for me, please?
On which side?
From
You
the
mean the
second
calculation of, huh?
from the second answer, please. How you got the 0.0039?
Okay. It's safer for you. Remember here you are saying 0.5 to the power of 2 multiplied by 0.125 to the power of 2, right? Your answer should be this. Are you able to get that amount?
Yes, I am.
Then 0.5 to the power of 2 multiplied by 0.1 to the power of 2. Are you able to get this amount?
Yes, I did.
And then this times the covariance. Remember, on the question they give you the covariance, right? Instead of giving you the correlation coefficient, they give you the covariance. Hence, we're multiplying by 0.03. Are you able to get this amount?
Yes, I am.
Yes. So which means you have to look for the sum of these amounts first. The answer that you're going to get, which is this one, is the one that you're not going to look for the square root of.
All right. Thank you.
Okay. Can we move on? On the next question, on question 3, they give us that information. And they say, conduct a detailed financial analysis using liquidity, efficiency, profitability, and leverage ratios, and interpret the ratios to enable your bank's credit committee to decide on the application. Then tabulate your results of the analysis to enhance clarity of your analysis. So they give us that information. And then on the template that they give us, we have the ratio. Then the ratio in 2016 and the ratio in 2015, and then the interpretation. So which means that we need to find out exactly, is it an improvement, or is it is the company failing to improve when it comes to its performance as well? So is it an increase in performance, or is it a decrease in performance of the company by now looking at the ratios over the 2 years, 2015 and 2016, according to those guidelines? So you will see that there's quite a number of ratios that they give us under these categories, where you look at liquidity, efficiency, profitability, and leverage ratios as well. So looking at this, if you start off with liquidity, the two main liquidity ratios are the two main liquidity ratios would be your current ratio and your quick ratio. So looking at the liquidity ratios, we have looking at the liquidity ratios, we have the current ratio. And what is the formula for the current ratio?
Current assets divided by current liabilities.
So it's our current assets divided by the current liabilities there, right? So looking at the information that is given, our current ratio for 2015, will be equal to our current assets, which are given as 1560 divided by the current liabilities, which are given as 810. So in this case, how much is going to be our current ratio?
1.93.
1.93. Then our current ratio for 2016 would be.
Sorry, Reynolds, where did you get 810 from? You added up all the liabilities.
If you check on the question, if you check on the balance sheet, they say current liabilities and provisions are given and for the years 2015 and 2016. So that's where I'm getting the information from. Are we together? All right. So for 2016, we have our current assets being 2340.
Sorry, Reynolds.
Yes.
When we do the ratio, and you always say because it's a ratio, it would be 1:1.93. Are we not doing it, or are we still gonna get to that point?
Either way, it's acceptable because it's 1.93 is to 1. You can put it as 1.93 is 1.
Okay, is it not where do we put the 1, before, after, or it doesn't matter?
Remember, you put it after because they're basically saying a figure of 1.93 is to 1. You're basically saying for every unit of current liabilities, we have 1.93 units of what? Of current assets. Remember, the current assets are the ones that are on top. So the figure that you're going to put on the here first is the one for the current assets. So the figure that you're going to put there first is the one for current assets. So if they say 1, so which means you can put it as 1.93 as to 1, even if you just leave it as 1.93, it's already also an accepted convention as well. Are we on the same page? Any questions? All right. Next, we look at for 2016, our current assets are given as 2340, and our current liabilities are 1050. So how much is our current ratio for 2016?
2.23.
2.23. What would be the interpretation? An increase in current ratio means, remember you're saying, current assets is what we owe, current liabilities is what we owe, right? So current assets is what we own, and current liabilities is what we owe, right? So which means, if that is the case, we're basically saying, how much is it that you own in the short term compared to what you're owing in the short term? So which means the higher the ratio, the higher your ability to meet your current liabilities, which is basically your short-term obligation here. So which means since the ratio is improved, it means based on the current ratio, the company has improved its what? Ability to meet its short-term obligation. So the company has improved its ability to increase to meet its short-term obligation. That will be your interpretation. So under that ratio, your interpretation would be the company has improved its ability to meet its short-term obligation based on the current ratio. Are we together? So your aim.
Please repeat.
Sorry.
Please repeat.
So the company has improved its ability to meet its short-term obligation. So the company has improved its ability to meet its short-term obligation. That would be your interpretation.
So if the liabilities were higher than the assets, how is going to be? How is the interpretation going to be?
It will be the opposite.
Okay.
So the case where the liabilities are more than the current asset, you will see that your current ratio falls to below 1. The moment your current ratio is below 1, it means the company might not be able to meet its short-term obligation. So it might struggle to meet and service its what? Short-term obligation. That is in the case where the ratio is below 1. Are we together? The other ratio that we can also look at, because usually when it comes to the liquidity ratios, there are two main ratios that they are mainly interested in when it comes to liquidity. The second ratio is the quick ratio, where the quick ratio is given as your current assets minus inventory over your current liabilities. So your quick ratio for 2015 would be given as, so your quick ratio for 2015 would be your current assets, we know they are 1560. Your inventory for 2015 on the question, they don't specifically indicate the values for the different for those ratios. Because we don't know what the inventory figures are. see, they don't specify the specific figures for inventory for those given years. So I think we would be better off just using the current ratio to assess the liquidity of the company, because they don't give us exactly what the amount of inventory was for 2015 and 2016. So I think we are better off not only relying on the current ratio in assessing the liquidity of the company there, because they don't specifically give us the values of inventory for each of those given years. So
What about
I
that
think,
421 value?
sorry?
What about that 421 value that's there?
Yeah, but it doesn't specify for which year is that inventory value. Because it would be 42.1. It's a value of 42.1, but still, I'm not sure for which year it will be trying to indicate the inventory value there, because it's not specifying for which year are we looking at this inventory figure. Is it for 2015? Is it for 2016? Or is it I'm not sure what that figure represents, because it's not even the average of the 2 years. So I am not sure how what that figure represents there. Yeah, it will be difficult to know what that figure represents, because it's just on a column on its own, and we're not sure exactly. It's not even indicating whether it's the average of the 2 years, because we don't know. So my assumption would be we're not given the values for those given years. So it will be very difficult to use or to do the calculation for the ratio if you don't have all the information that is required for that question. So under this, I would say we don't have all the information for the quick ratio. So for assessing the liquidity of the organization, we are going to be using the current ratio in this case. And we have a current ratio, which we saw that is what has improved. Then from there, we are going to move on and analyze the efficiency ratio. So from there, we're going to look at move on and analyze the efficiency ratios. And when you look at the efficiency ratios there, but can we take a 10-minute break until 9:45? Can we take a 10-minute break until 9:45? Then at 9:45, we'll continue with the ratios. Can we take a 10-minute break until 9:45? All right, can we continue? When it comes to this question, I feel like the way it was structured, there's information which is basically missing on the info that is intended to be used on the question that they ask us to look at as well. Because if you check in our textbook, remember the next question, the next part of the question was asking us to look at efficiency ratios, which is basically our activity ratios. If you check under our activity ratios, this is where we find ratios such as the stock holding period, the data collection period, the creditors payment period, and the creditors payment period. Then we have the working capital to total asset ratio, the working capital to sales ratio, and the fixed asset to total asset ratio, and the average depreciation ratio as well. If you check on these ratios, the most predominantly used ratios to make an assessment on the company would be looking at the stock holding period, the data collection period, the creditors payment period. So if you check on our question, we are not able to deduce that information because remember, they didn't give us that information from the information that they presented to us there. Because if you check on the information that they presented to us, they only give us the total figures and there's information missing in between there as well. So my thinking would be, I'm not sure exactly how they would have wanted us to answer these questions because there's information that is vital, which is missing for us to be able to answer this question as well. And I'm failing to understand where these figures would be coming from. Because you can't even say they are average figures. And you can't say these figures are expected to remain the same over the period as well, because then what is the point of making the assessment of the ratios as well? So I'm not sure exactly what was being expected of us when it comes to this question. But if you check on the information that we have, and if you look at the activity ratios, it would mean when it comes to the activity ratios, probably the activity ratios that we're going to be able to analyze would be the working capital to total asset ratio, the working capital to sales ratio, and your fixed assets to total asset ratio as well. So these are probably the ratios that are going to be able to utilize and use them to analyze when it comes to the efficiency ratios as well. So when you look at the working capital to total assets ratio, remember they say is your working capital divided by your total asset. Your working capital is basically your current assets, right? Then when it comes to your working capital to sales ratio, it's basically your working capital divided by the value of your sales ratio. Then your fixed assets total asset ratio is your fixed asset over your total assets ratio as well. So which means in this case, it would mean if we are now looking at the efficiency ratio, so if we're now going to be looking at the efficiency ratio, the first efficiency ratio that we would look at would be the working capital to total asset ratio. So it would be the working capital to total asset ratio, which is your working capital over total assets. So your working capital in this case would be the information that you have under your current assets. And remember, your current assets in this case is equals to a figure of 23.40. So your working capital ratio for 2015. So your working capital to total asset ratio for 2015 would be equal to your working capital, which is your current assets for 2015 of 1560. 1560. So it's actually 15.60 divided by your total assets, under 2015, your total assets are worth an amount of 49.30. So your total assets are worth 49.30. So given this information, how much is your working capital to total asset ratio? How much would be your working capital to total asset ratio? Still the same ratio. So how much would you get? How much?
0.3164.
So it's 0.32. And then our working capital to total asset ratio for 2016 would be equal to the working capital to total asset ratio for 2016 would be our working capital, which is our current assets of 23.40. Note that I put commas here because it's actually 23. There's a comma, there's supposed to be a comma in between there, but the answers won't make a difference. The answers will still remain the same. So it's 23.40 divided by our total assets, which are equal to 57.90. So in this case, how much is our working capital to total asset ratio?
Is it 0.40?
0.40. So ideally, when it comes to the working capital to total assets ratio, we want this ratio to decline or to go down. So ideally, we want this ratio to go down. So a decrease in the ratio means an improvement in the efficiency of using what? The working capital. So in this case, we see that it increased. So it means that the company is decreased in its efficiency of utilization of the working capital. So the company is decreased in its efficiency of the utilization of the working capital, because ideally we want this ratio to go down. So the more this ratio goes down, the more efficiently we're utilizing what? Our working capital. Are we on the same page?
Sorry, Ronas, can you just repeat that? The company has
decreased in its efficiency of utilization of the working capital. So the company has decreased in its efficiency of the utilization of the working capital, because ideally you want this ratio to go down, because the more this ratio goes down, the more efficient you're utilizing what? Your working capital, because it means you're relying less on your current assets. Because remember, if this ratio goes up like this, what is a typical example of a working capital asset, of a working capital item would be, for example, your cash. The more you're holding cash, the more this ratio goes up. But now the problem would be, if you're going to be holding more cash in your business, it basically means that you are now having a situation where you're not efficiently utilizing that cash, because that money should be used for other things. The more cash you're keeping on hand, the lesser it's going to be making money for the organization as well. The next ratio would be the working capital to sales ratio. So the next ratio would be the working capital to sales ratio. So it's your working capital divided by
just before
the
you continue. Rhinos, can I ask you to maybe explain for the last time the two figures, the 0.32 and the 0.40? You said that there's an increase or a decrease.
There's an increase. The ratio is increased because from 0.3 it was increased to 0.40, isn't it? The
Yes,
ratio
correct.
is going up from 0.32 to 0.40. But now the interpretation is, if the ratio goes up like this, it means you're not efficiently utilizing your working capital. Are we on the same page? If the ratio goes up, it means you're not efficiently utilizing your working capital. Because ideally, you want this ratio to go down. So in this case, that's why we said there's a decrease in the efficiency of the utilization of the working capital. So the company is not efficiently utilizing its working capital. So that's basically what has happened. So the company is decreased in its efficiency of the utilization of what? Of the working capital. So the utilization of the working capital is what has decreased, not necessarily the ratio. Are we on the same page? Okay, okay. So ideally, you want this ratio to go up. Remember, a typical example of a working capital item is, for example, a typical example of a working capital item would be cash. It means if this ratio goes up, probably you're holding more cash on hand, right? But if the company is holding more cash on hand, it means that that money should be used for other things to make more money for the organization. But if you're going to be holding more cash on hand, it means you're not utilizing that cash efficiently, because ideally you want the organization, whenever they have cash, they use that money to make more money. Not what? Not to hang on to that money as well. Are we together then? Okay. So the next ratio is your working capital to asset ratio. For 2015, so your working capital to sales ratio, for your working capital to sales ratio, for 2015, it was equal to 15.60 divided by your sales revenue, which is given as 62.3. So how much do you get then?
$0.25.
0.25. Then the working capital to sales ratio for 2016 would be, for 2016, we have current assets being 23.40 divided by our sales, which is 70.1.
That's 0.33.
0.33. 33. Okay. Ideally, we want this ratio to go down. So ideally, we want this ratio to go down. Because if this ratio goes down, it means our working capital policy in our pursuit of sales revenue would what? Would be increasing. But what do we see? This ratio is actually increased, isn't it? So since the ratio is increased, it means our efficiency of working capital policy in generating sales has decreased. Our efficiency of the working capital policy in generating sales has decreased. Our efficiency of the working capital policy in generating sales has decreased. So our efficiency of the working capital policy in generating sales has decreased. The next one is the working capital is your fixed assets to total asset ratio. Your fixed assets to total asset ratio. And this is given as your fixed assets over your total assets. If you check on the question, they tell us that our net fixed assets for 2015 were 33.20. So our fixed assets to total asset ratio for 2015 is 33.20 divided by our total assets were 49.30.
Is it 0.67?
0.67. Then our fixed assets to total asset ratio for 2016 is, for 2016, we get a figure of our fixed assets are 33 divided by our total assets, which are 57.90. And how much do we get?
0.57.
0.57. So a decline in the ratio. So this is very subjective because it will depend on exactly which industry you are in. A decline in the ratio may indicate an effective maintenance of fixed assets in good working condition. So a decline in the ratio may indicate an effective maintenance of fixed assets in good working condition. So in this case, since the ratio is declined from 0.67 to from 0.67 to 0.57, it means the company may have an effective maintenance of fixed assets in good working condition. So the company may be having an effective maintenance of fixed assets in good working condition. So the company may be having an effective maintenance of fixed assets in good working condition. But remember, this is very subjective as well.
So Reynolds, for this one, the ratio must be higher.
So for this one, if you check in the textbook, let's quickly, because it's very subjective when it comes to this particular ratio. It's just like some of the debt ratios as well. If you check in the textbook, they say higher ratios highlight the significance of fixed assets for the business. So it highlights the nature of the business. So manufacturing and real estate businesses have a high ratio, while service industries generally have a low ratio. But generally, a falling ratio may indicate fixed assets getting older as it becomes depreciated, which may suggest immediate replacement or effective maintenance of fixed assets not in good working condition. So it basically means that your assets are reducing in value because they are being depreciated, but at the same time, you are able to maintain them, to actually keep them working in good working conditions, although they are depreciating.
Yes, because my question was going to be, how do they then deal with the issues of wear and tear and maintenance? Is it assumed that these are maintained?
So it's very subjective. So it means that if the mere fact that the company is able to continue using those assets as well, even though they are suffering from wear and tear, it basically means that it might also indicate that is either they need to replace the asset immediately, or it might be because the company is actually able to maintain their assets in good working condition, such that they are able to continue utilizing those assets as well.
Okay, thanks, Linus.
Okay. Can you move on? The next set of ratios that they ask us to look at is profitability ratios. So the next set of ratios that they ask us to look at is profitability ratios. And looking at profitability ratios,
Rhinos, I just want to ask, when we are given a question like this and there are multiple ratios, do we only use the ratios where the amounts are given on the table?
Yes, you have now checked to see which ratios are relevant for the amounts which are given on the table as well.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Rhinos.
All right. So that's why you see that we ended up not utilizing the usual ratios. Like, for example, when you look at the data collection period, the credit collection period, and the average age of inventory. Those are the common ratios which are usually used. But because we didn't have the information of ways of getting that information, we ended up not utilizing those ratios as well. So now we're going to be looking at, they ask us to look at profitability ratios. And when we look at the profitability ratio, the first profitability ratio that we can look at there is your gross profit ratio. And your gross profit ratio is your gross profit divided by your sales. So the first profitability ratio that we can use there is the gross profit ratio. And your gross profit ratio is your gross profit over sales. So which means in this case, it's equal to your gross, so it's your gross profit margin. We refer to it as your gross profit margin, which is your gross profit over sales. So your gross profit margin for 2015 would be equal to our gross profit for 2015 was given as 14.8 divided by the sales of 62.3 multiplied by 100. So how much would we get as our gross profit margin?
Is it 24? Because it's 23.75. So is it going to be 24%?
So it's 23.75.
Yes.
3.75%.
Gonna
Then
be 76 actually. If you are rounding off, because it's 7.56. Yes.
So it's 23.76%.
Yes.
Then from here, we have for 2016, our gross profit margin for 2016 would be equal to, our gross profit for 2016 was 14.9 divided by our sales of 70.1. Multiply that by 100. How much is the gross profit margin?
$21.26.
21.26. Our aim when it comes to the gross profit margin is to improve the gross profit margin. So which means in this case, the company's profitability has declined. So by looking at the gross profit margin, the company's profitability, after taking into account the cost of goods sold, so the company's profitability, after taking into account the cost of goods sold, has declined. So the company's profitability, after taking into account the cost of goods sold, has declined. Then we also need to calculate the operating profit margin, which is given as your operating profit over your sales, multiply that by 100, because it comes in as a percentage. And if you check on the question, they give us the operating profit, and our operating profit margin for 2015 was, our operating profit was 9.9, and our sales is 62.3 multiplied by 100. And how much is our operating profit margin?
$15.89.
15.89. Then our operating profit margin for 2016 is, our operating profit was 9.3 divided by sales of 70.1, multiply that by 100. It's percentages.
$18.7.
It's what? 13?
13.27.
13.27%. So our profitability, after taking into account the cost of goods sold and the operating expenses, has declined. Because remember, our aim is for the operating profit margin to go up. So in this case, it has gone down. So our profitability, after taking into account the cost of goods sold and the operating expenses, has declined. So our profitability, after taking into account the cost of goods sold and the operating expenses, has declined. Are we together? Then we have the net profit margin. And our net profit margin is our net profit divided by the sales multiplied by 100. If you check on our question, for 2015, our net profit is the earnings available to ordinary shares. So is the earnings available to ordinary shares. So if you check on the information there, you will see that they, if you look at 2015, we have earnings before interest and tax. We take out taxes, and then we have the profit after tax. Now the dividends in this case, it would be the dividends to ordinary, would be assuming that is the dividends to ordinary shareholders. Because on the question, if you look at our capital structure, do we have any preference shares? We don't have any preference shares. So which means the dividends in this case would be the dividends are paid out to ordinary shareholders. But remember, when you're calculating your net profit margin, your net profit is basically your earnings available to ordinary shareholders. So this is the earnings before you pay out the dividends. So which means in this case, the profit after tax is the earnings available to ordinary shareholders. So the profit after tax is the earnings available to ordinary shareholders. So based on this, it would mean for 2015, our net profit is the profit after tax, which is given as 4.2, divided by our sales of 62.3, and then multiply that by 100. How much is our net profit margin?
$6.74.
6.74%. And our net profit margin for 2016 would be our net profit, which is in this case, the profit after tax is 3.3 over the sales figure of 70.1 multiplied by 100. How much do we get?
4.7071.
4.71. Our aim is for the net profit margin to be as high as possible. So our aim is for the net profit margin to be as high as possible. So based on this, if you look at our net profit margin, it has gone down, isn't it? So our profitability it's after we take into account all payments to stakeholders. So our profitability the business the returns to ordinary shareholders. So our profitability has declined. So our profitability has declined as the returns to ordinary shareholders has declined. So as the returns to ordinary shareholders, as the rate of return to ordinary shareholders from the generated sales has declined. So our profitability has declined as the rate of return generated to the owners of the business as a percentage of sales has declined. So in this case, our profitability has declined because from 6.74%, it has gone down to 4.71%. So our profitability has declined as the rate of return to the owners of the business as a percentage of sales has declined. So our profitability has declined as the rate of return to the owners of the business as a percentage of sales has declined. So we say the profitability in this case has declined because the rate of return to ordinary shareholders as a percentage of sales has declined in this case. On the next set of ratios that they ask us to look at, we need to look at the leverage ratios. So we need to look at the leverage ratios. And when we look at the leverage ratios, if you check in the textbook, under leverage ratios, So under leverage ratios, if you check in the textbook under the leverage ratios, they say will doubling the sales always result in doubling the net profit? How can a business achieve a disproportionate increase in net profit versus sales growth? So in this case, under leverage ratios, they ask us to look at the operating leverage, which is given as your sales minus your variable cost over your operating profit. Then they also ask us to look at the financial leverage, which is your operating profit over your net profit. Then they also ask us to look at the total leverage, which is given as your operating leverage multiplied by your financial leverage gives us the total leverage. So these are the three leverage ratios that we need to be able to look at. So if you check on the information that we have on the question, our sales, we have it. Our operating profit, we have it. Remember here they say it's your sales minus variable costs over your operating profit. So now what is not clear is now the breakdown of our operating expenses. Now to say, for us to know exactly what was the breakdown of our operating expenses, we will need to know exactly for our cost of goods sold, which ones were fixed, which ones were variable. And for operating expenses, we also need to know which ones were fixed, which ones were variable. And if you check on the information that we have there, we are not able to deduce this that information. Can you please do me a favor? When it comes to the leverage ratios, we're not able to deduce, because in the textbook, when they look at the leverage ratio, they're talking about the degree of operating leverage, the degree of financial leverage, and the degree of total leverage as well. And for us to be able to calculate that, the degree of operating leverage, we're not able to calculate it, because remember, when you look at our expenses, they don't give us the breakdown of exactly which ones of our expenses were fixed and which ones of our expenses were variable. We're not able to deduce that. When it comes to the degree of financial leverage, we are able to do that because remember, we have our operating profit and we have our net profit there. But now for us to be able to calculate the degree of total leverage, we need to be able to calculate or deduce the degree of what? Of operating leverage. Because there's another way of calculating it as well, where we can look at the, we need your change in sales over change in profit there. It's a change in operating profit over change in sales revenue, sales in units. Yeah, still not able to deduce it. Can you please check with the lecturer what would be required for us to answer the question on leverage ratios? what would be required for us, what information which ratios we need for us to be able to calculate the question, to answer the question on leverage ratios. Because here, we are not able to determine the degree of operating leverage in this case. So the only real leverage ratio we're able to determine would be the financial leverage ratio. But usually on its own, we're not able to do the analysis of that ratio on its own as well, because we need to know exactly what is the degree of operating leverage, then overall, what is the degree of total leverage as well. So if we are to calculate the if we are to calculate the degree of operating leverage, so if we are to calculate the degree of operating leverage, so if we are to calculate the degree of financial leverage, our financial leverage is given as your operating profit over your net profit. So it's your operating profit divided by your net profit, which means your financial leverage for 2015 would be given as your financial leverage for 2015 would be your operating profit is 9.9 and your net profit is your profit after tax, which is 4.2. So in this case, how much would you get as your financial leverage?
$2.36.
2.36. Remember, your operating leverage, your financial leverage, and your total leverage, they are just figures on their own, right? Or it can be given as a number of times, but they're just basically figures on their own. You don't put them as in rand, you don't put them as percentages, you just leave them as figures on as they are as well. Then, when you look at your financial leverage for 2016, it would be given as your operating profit was 9.3. And your net profit was 3.3. So how much would you get? $2.82. So you get 2.82. So when you look at the leverage ratios, if you check in the textbook, when you look at the leverage ratios, they say, when you look at the operating leverage, your operating leverage is given as your sales minus variable cost over operating profit. And here they say, operating leverage tends to be high for a business with high fixed costs. So increased fixed costs are risky because such costs are not compressible when demand drops and revenue streams dries up. However, at high levels of sales, it results in enhanced profitability, as evident from the example that is given there as well. So which means operating leverage basically reflects your business risk. So the higher the business risk, the higher the operating leverage, the higher the business risk that the firm is going to be facing as well. Then the next one is your financial leverage. And here they say your financial leverage is given as the operating profit over net profit. And here they say financial leverage is high for a business with high interest burden. So a higher interest burden is risky because it is not compressible when the firm does not make sufficient profit, operating profit, which usually happens when demand drops and revenue streams dries up. So what do we see? Financial leverage is basically reflecting the financial risk of the company. So financial leverage is basically reflecting the financial risk of the company as well. Then we also look at total leverage. So total leverage basically is basically the multiple of the operating leverage and the financial leverage. So here they say total leverage is calculated by multiplying the operating leverage and the financial leverage. So it examines the combined impact of fixed costs and fixed interest burden on the business. So in other words, the determinants of total leverage are the level of fixed cost and the interest burden. So during boom times, a high total leverage sharply increases profitability. However, during tough times, a high total leverage results in a sharp drop in what? Profitability as well. So which basically means that your operating leverage indicates the business risk and your financial leverage reflects your financial risk. Then your total leverage is basically indicating the effects of your business risk and your financial risk combined together as well. So which means in this case, we see that your financial leverage, as you can see, your operating profit is given as the, if you look at your financial leverage for 2015, it was 2.36. And if you look at your financial leverage for if you look at your financial leverage for 2016, it was 2.82. So remember we said financial leverage reflects the use of fixed cost financing to improve profitability of the organization. So the higher the financial leverage, the higher the use of fixed cost financing, and also the higher the financial risk of the company as well. So in this case, our financial leverage has increased from 2.36 to 2.82. So which basically means that the company's use of fixed cost financing has increased, which also reflects an increase in what? Financial risk as well. So the company's use of fixed cost financing has increased, which also reflects an increase in what? Financial risk of the company. So your interpretation would be the company's use of fixed cost financing has increased, which also reflects an increase in financial risk of the company. So the company's use of fixed cost financing has increased, which reflects the increase in what? Financial risk of the company. Can we move on? question 4, on question 4, they give us that information. So they ask us to calculate the expected return in the standard deviation of the portfolio. Just like what we did previously, for some reason, I feel like it's just a repetition of the same questions that we've seen previously as well. So here they say, your bank has a portfolio of 2 assets to the value of 10,000. So the assets are to the value of 10,000 and both assets weigh the same in the portfolio. Then they say, they give us that information, then they say, calculate the expected return in the standard deviation of the portfolio as well. So to calculate the expected return in the standard deviation, we are going to say our expected return. So it's just a repetition of the same question somehow that we've seen before. So which means in this case, we're going to say, asset 1, the investment in asset 1 is given as, remember they say they weigh the same in the portfolio, right? And the portfolio is to the value of 10,000. So it's going to be 10,000 divided by 2 because it's 2 assets, which gives us 5,000. And then, which means your asset 1 has an investment of 5,000, which also means asset 2 has an investment of 5,000, which gives us a total value of the portfolio being equal to 10,000. So which means your weight of asset 1 is equals to 5,000 over 10,000, which gives us a weight of 0.5. And the weight of asset 2 is equals to 5,000 over 10,000, which gives us a weight of what? 0.5. Which also means our expected return is given as the sum of the returns multiplied by the weight. So which means in this case, it's going to be equal to, for asset 1, it's a return of 15 times the weight of 0.5. For asset 2, it's a return of 10 multiplied the weight of 0.5. So how much is going to be the expected return of the portfolio? So it's 12.5%. Then the standard deviation of the portfolio is equal to the square root of the weight of asset 1 squared times the standard deviation of asset 1 squared plus the weight of asset 2 squared times the standard deviation of asset 2 squared plus 2 times the weight of asset 1 times the weight of asset 2 times the correlation coefficient between asset 1 and 2 times the standard deviation of asset 1 times the standard deviation of asset 2. So this will give us the standard deviation of the portfolio. So which means in this case, it's going to be the square root of the weight of asset 1, which is 0.5 squared, times the standard deviation of asset 1, which is given as 20%, so it's 0.2 squared, plus the weight of asset 2, which is 0.5 squared, times the standard deviation of asset 2, which is 0.15 squared, plus 2 multiplied by, if you check on the information that they give us the covariance of the assets. So which means if they give us the covariance of the assets, they've already done that part of the calculation for us. So which means we're going to say 2 multiplied by the weight of asset 1, times the weight of asset 2 times the covariance, which is given as 0.02, because it's 2%. So given this information, how much do you get? Are we getting the same amounts? Are we getting the same amounts?
Yes.
Okay.
Reynolds,
Yes.
again, I understand everything. Just please explain again the covariance portion. This
Right.
P1 and 2 specifically.
By definition, your covariance of acid 1 and 2 is given as the correlation coefficient of acid 1 and 2 multiplied by the standard deviation of acid 1 multiplied by the standard deviation of acid 2. So that's the formula for covariance. So what do we see? Do you see that on the question, they didn't give us the correlation, they didn't give us the standard, we already have the standard deviations there,
Yes.
but they didn't give us the correlations. So
Yes.
which means, since they already give us the covariance here, it means instead of us worrying about this part of the formula, this part of the formula has already been given to us because they give us the covariance already.
What is
Are we
the,
together?
oh, the 2%?
The 2%. They say the
Okay.
covariance is equal to 2%. So instead of us calculating this part of the formula, it means they've already what? Done that for us already. So the only thing that we have to account for after the plus sign is the 2 multiplied by the weights multiplied by the covariance, which is what we've done here.
No, I understand now. So I just.
Rhinos. Rhinos. Rhinos.
Yes.
I was taking equation 2 and equation 4. They are both looking similar. So I wanted to just get a little knowledge about the assets. Like in this case, we have 2 assets to the value of 10,000. So it means these 2 assets, they are both included in 10,000. And here
Yes,
we have
because the portfolio, the value of the portfolio in total is what? 10,000. So it means if the value of the portfolio total is 10,000 and they are equally invested in the portfolio, it would mean the weight of the amount investment of the investment in the assets would be 10,000 divided by 2.
Okay, and for this one, it means 2 loans for 5 million each. Okay.
Each, yeah.
It's fine.
Okay.
And just another one, just this portfolio on the covariance equation, the portfolio 1 and 2, what number, if we were not given the covariance, what number would we put here? Sorry, I missed that one.
If you're not given the covariance.
Yeah, and you have to determine it yourself before you can determine the standard deviation.
If they don't give you the covariance, they'll give you the correlation coefficient. So if they give you the correlation
so
coefficient,
it's a given number.
Yes. So it's either they give you the covariance or they give you the correlation coefficient. It's always going to be one of the two.
Okay,
So if they
work
given you
same.
the correlation coefficient, then it would mean you need to put it here as a decimal. No, it's just a figure on this one. So it will mean that they will give you the correlation coefficient. You have to put it here. Then you multiply that by the standard deviation, and then you multiply that by the standard deviation of asset 1 and 2. That is in the case where they give you the correlation coefficient. So if they've given you the correlation coefficient, it would mean you will have to now use the given correlation coefficient to now know exactly what the instead of, if they're giving you the correlation coefficient, you are going to follow this formula as is by putting the correlation coefficient here and then multiplying it by the standard deviations, which we already have there as well.
But if they don't give it to us, okay, my question then now becomes, are these two values always given, or is there a point you can have to
all
determine
the time?
it?
All the time.
They're a given figure. Okay.
All the time. They'll always give you. It's either they give you the correlation coefficient or they give you the covariance. It's always one of the two.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. Can we move on? The last question on this paper was looking at question 5. And question 5, we have seen it before in the Jan-Feb 2017 as well. And remember here they say, in order to make your contribution as discussed, prepare a procedure manual explaining the stages to be followed in order to effectively manage the credit risk of your bank. And remember what we said in the Jan-Feb 2017, you find your answer on page 31 of the textbook, which is section 3.8. And the steps usually followed by a financial intermediary are listed below. The nature and purpose of the credit, the type of the credit facility, the capacity to borrow, looking at the security, then analyze the borrower's financial status, then focus the repayment capacity, and look at the profitability of the borrower. Then look at structure the credit facility, including the conditions and covenants. Then over time, you have to do constant monitoring of the credit facility as well. So these are the stages that you need to follow. So you get your answer on section 3.8, which is page 31 of the textbook. Are there any questions? All right, if there are no questions, enjoy the rest of your weekend. Please keep revising. You start seeing that some of the questions, you'll be familiar with them. So what we're going to do in the next section is that in the next class, we are now going to start picking and choosing potential questions that you have not seen before that can potentially come in the exam as well. Then if there's any concepts you find difficult, please send to me via WhatsApp so that I'm able to have a look at them, so that we're able to look at them in the class as well.
Sorry, Reynolds, before you go, can we just look at the wording of that June 2017 paper and this question wording, please?
Sorry?
Can we look at the wording of the of the Feb 2017 paper and the June 2017 paper for this question?
Rhinos,
Yes?
also the exam prep exercise, when are we going to do them?
We can do them in the next class as well. For the Feb 2017 paper, this was the wording. All right, enjoy the rest of your weekend.